Welcome back, and thank you for being here. You are listening to Darwin and the Human Mind. And in today's video, Darwin, Animal Behavior, and the Rise of Evolutionary Psychology, we are following one of the most important idea shifts in modern intellectual history. This video is made for listening pleasure. It begins with Darwin, but it does not end with fossils or finches. It moves into instinct, learning animal behavior, behaviorism, sociobiology, and the long argument over whether the human mind itself has an evolutionary past. By the end, the goal is not just to understand a few scientific schools of thought. It is to see why this story changed the way people think about human nature itself. There are some ideas that do not simply add information to the world. They change the emotional atmosphere of thought itself. They alter what people feel is possible to say about life, about nature, and about themselves. Darwin's theory of evolution was one of those ideas. Before Darwin, many people still imagined living things as fixed forms. Species seemed stable. Human beings seemed safely set apart. Nature could be admired, classified, and described, but it did not tell a full historical story about how life became what it is. Darwin shattered that stillness. He argued that life has a past, that species are not permanent, and that the living world has been shaped across immense stretches of time by variation, struggle, inheritance, and selection. Once that idea took hold, a much deeper question followed close behind it. If the body has a history, does the mind have one too? If natural selection helped shape claws, wings, hands, eyes, and brains, then what about fear? Attachment, aggression, cooperation, jealousy, love, curiosity, parenting, and social behavior? Or did they also come out of a long natural history? That was the door Darwin helped open, even if it took decades for others to walk fully through it. The story sharpens in 1858. Darwin had spent years developing his ideas about evolution by natural selection. He had gathered evidence slowly, carefully, and with a great deal of hesitation. He knew the implications were enormous. He also knew the reaction would not be mild. Then, in the June of that year, a letter arrived from Alfred Russel Wallace, a younger naturalist working the Malay archipelago. Inside was an essay laying out a theory of evolution by natural selection that was startlingly close to Darwin's own. For Darwin, this was not a small professional inconvenience. It was a moment of collapse. He had been thinking about these ideas for years. He feared that what he considered the work of a lifetime was about to slip away. At the same time, his personal life was shaken by illness, family grief, and exhaustion. The moment was painful, tense, and deeply human. The modern story of evolution did not begin as a clean triumph. It began in anxiety. A compromise was arranged by Darwin's allies. Wallace's essay and Darwin's related work were presented together before the Linnean Society in London on the 1st of July, 1858. The reaction was muted. There was no immediate thunderclap. No one in the room seemed to have fully grasped that one of the great intellectual transformations of modern history had just formally entered public science. Yet that quiet event marked the first public announcement of evolution by natural selection. History sometimes changes in moments that feel strangely small while they are happening. Darwin then pushed forward with the book he had delayed for so long. After corrections, stress, illness, and intense effort, On the Origin of Species appeared in 1859. It sold out quickly. A second edition was soon planned. From that point on, man's place in nature was no longer what it had been before. Darwin had taken the living world out of the timelessness and placed it inside history. One of the most important words in that revolution is selection. Natural selection is not a mind. It is not a conscious force choosing the winners. It is a process. Organisms vary. Some variations help survival and reproduction more than others in a given environment. Over time, those traits become more common. That process is cold, impersonal, and incredibly powerful. It does not ask what is noble or beautiful. It asks only what persists. Another key word is species. Darwin's great break with older thought was the claim that species are not fixed forever. Wolves, birds, insects, trees, and human beings all belong to lineages. They have histories. They came from somewhere. They changed. That idea alone was enough to unsettle old certainties. But the deeper disturbance was still waiting. Darwin was cautious in how directly he applied these ideas to humans in On the Origin of Species. Still, the implication was obvious. If human beings belong to nature, then the human body must have a history like every other body. And if the body has a history, the mind cannot remain untouched by that fact forever. Darwin himself believed psychology would eventually be placed on a new foundation. He was predicting that the study of thought, feeling, and behavior would one day be rebuilt in the light of evolution. That did not happen quickly. Biology moved more confidently into evolutionary thinking than psychology did. Psychology often seemed fragmented. Different schools focused on different parts of the puzzle. Some were interested in consciousness, others in introspection, others in learning. others in unconsciousness. There's often no single unifying paradigm, no broad framework strong enough to organize the field as a whole. In that sense, psychology lagged behind Darwin. The road back to Darwin ran through animals. In the 20th century, two major approaches to animal behavior became especially important. One was ethology, which grew most strongly in Europe. The other was comparative psychology, which became especially influential in the United States. Both studied behavior. Both shaped modern psychology, but they often approached the problem very differently. Ethology was interested in animals as living creatures in relation to their natural way of life. It was concerned with behavior in an evolutionary setting. Comparative psychology often leaned harder toward controlled experiments and laboratory observation. One tradition looked outward toward species, ecology, and natural patterns. The other looked inward toward controlled conditions, measurable responses, and learning. Both saw something real, neither saw the whole picture alone. Among the most important figures in ethology were Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen. Lorenz had originally trained as a doctor, but he was strongly influenced by work on birds and by efforts to compare animal species in evolutionary terms. He helped build a science that treated animal behavior not as random motion, but as something patterned, species typical, and meaningful in evolutionary history. Lorenz became famous for his work on newly hatched birds and the process later known as imprinting. In certain cases, a young bird quickly forms a powerful attachment to the first moving object it encounters after hatching. Chicks would follow him as though he were their mother. The image is memorable because it feels almost tender, even strange, but the scientific significance was serious. The young animal was not learning just anything at any time. It seemed biologically prepared to learn something specific during a specific window. That was a major clue. Development mattered, but the development was not separate from inheritance. Biology and experience were interacting from the beginning. Lorenz also stressed the importance of comparing one species with the related species and understanding the behavior in evolutionary context. In doing so, he pulled behavior closer to biology. He was willing to draw strong lines between human beings and other animals. That willingness made his work powerful, but it also made it controversial. Once the study of animal behavior begins pressing toward human behavior, the ground becomes a bit more charged. Scientists are no longer talking about birds or fish. They are moving toward a theory of human nature. Tinbergen added one of the most lasting contributions in the entire history of behavior studies. He clarified the kinds of questions that should be asked if we want to understand behavior properly. He argued that there are 4 different whys of behavior, and that confusion arises when people mistake one kind of answer for the other. First, what causes the behavior in an immediate sense? What are the mechanisms at work right now? That is causation, often called proximate cause. Hormones, nerves, environmental cues, temperature, day length, and physiological triggers can all matter here. Second, how does the behavior develop in the individual? That is ontogeny. It asks how behavior takes shape over the life of one organism. Does it appear early? Does it require experience? Does it emerge only under certain developmental conditions? Third, how did the behavior evolve in the history of species? That is the evolutionary question. And fourth, what is this behavior for? What is the adaptive value? What is the survival or reproductive significance? That is function, and is closely tied to ultimate causation. This was an elegant framework because it showed that behavior has layers. One answer is not good enough. To understand why birds migrate, you can ask what triggers the migration right now. That it might involve changing light or temperature. You can ask how the individual bird acquires the ability to migrate. Is part of it learned? You can ask how the migration arose in the evolutionary history of the lineage. And then you can ask the deepest Darwinian question of all. What advantage made such dangerous and energy-consuming journeys worth it in the long run? Tinbergen used the example of weed eaters migrating to Africa. That example is powerful because it captures the difference between levels of explanation. A bird flying thousands of miles is not explained by one sentence. Immediate triggers matter. Development matters. Evolutionary history matters. Functions matter. If we ask only one question, we miss the full story. The fourth question brings us to another important term, fitness. A trait matters not because it looks impressive, but because it helps an organism survive and leave descendants. If behavior persists over long stretches of evolutionary time, then it likely did something, under some conditions, that improved success in the survival or reproduction. As influential as ethology was, it ran into serious criticism. One problem was the heavy early use of the word innate. Too often, behavior was described as though it could be sorted neatly into 2 boxes, inherited or learned. Over time, that looked too simple. Researchers found again and again that development involved both heredity and environment. Work on birds made this especially clear. Pecking ducklings, for example, were Is it pecking or peking? I'm not sure. Peking ducklings, for example, were found able to recognize the call of their species if they heard it during embryonic development, even while still in the shell. William Thorpe's work on chaffinches showed something equally important. The capacity for song may be partly inherited, but the final form of the song depends on the exposure at the right time. The young bird has to hear the adult song. It also has to hear itself. Development is structured, but is not sealed off from experience. This was a major turning point. The deeper scientists look, the less convincing the simple division between nature and nurture became. Behavior was increasingly understood as the product of interaction. Organisms develop within environments, and they even shape parts of those environments through their own behavior. That is a subtler and more realistic picture than either pure instinct or pure learning. While European ethologists were wrestling with these questions, a different tradition was advancing with great force in America. Comparative psychology had roots in the study of animal behavior under controlled conditions. And one of the most famous early figures was Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov demonstrated that dogs could learn associations between events. If the sound of a bell repeatedly accompanied the arrival of food, the dog would eventually salivate at the bell alone. This became the classic example of classical conditioning. Pavlov's work mattered because it showed how rigorously observable learning could be studied. He focused on what animals did, not on the unseen speculation about what they might be privately experiencing. That drive toward objectivity would become even stronger in the movement that followed, behaviorism. Behaviorism aimed to make psychology harder, leaner, and more empirical. It rejected what it saw as vague and unscientific language about consciousness or inner mental life. The most famous early champion of this approach was John B. Watson. Watson argued that psychology should concern itself with stimuli and responses, with behavior that could be observed and measured. He believed science should abandon reference to consciousness as a legitimate object of explanation. Watson also pushed a radical form of environmentalism. In this context, environmentalism does not mean concern for the natural world. It means the view that behavior is changed mainly by environment, conditioning, and experience rather than inherited tendencies. Watson made one of the most extreme statements in the history of psychology when he claimed that, given control over upbringing, he could take healthy infants and train them to almost any type of adult he chose. It was one of the clearest expressions of blank slate impulse in modern thought. There is something emotionally revealing about behaviorism when it first appears. It carries a kind of a confidence, even severity. It promises control. It promises precision. It promises to strip psychology of mystical vagueness and rebuild it as a proper science. That promise was attractive, especially in a scientific culture that increasingly valued objectivity, experiment, and measurable proof. This is where another important term enters the story: positivism, especially logical positivism. This philosophical outlook held that meaningful scientific statements should be observable, operationally definable, and verifiable. Claims that could not be checked in empirical terms were often treated with deep suspicion. Behaviorism fit naturally with the worldview. If the mind could not be directly observed, many behaviorists preferred not to talk about it at all. By the early 20th century, and especially by the years 1910 and 1960, behaviorism became deeply embedded in American psychology. It was not merely a method, it became, for a time, the dominant experimental style of the field. It proved highly influential in laboratory science and in practical efforts to shape behavior. B.F. Skinner carried the behaviorist project further than anyone else. He became famous for operant conditioning, the study of how behavior is shaped by reinforcement. If a behavior is rewarded, it becomes more likely to occur again. If it is not rewarded or is punished, it may become less likely. Skinner used animals like pigeons to demonstrate how powerfully consequences could shape repeated behavior. This work was real and important. It revealed something deep about learning. But behaviorism also began to show its limits. In its most ambitious form, it tried to explain too much while refusing to speak clearly about inner mental structure. That problem became especially obvious when it approached language. Skinner attempted to interpret language as a form of behavior shaped by reinforcement, but the criticism that followed was devastating. In 1959, Noam Chomsky argued that behaviorism could not adequately explain language acquisition or the creativity of human speech. Human beings do not simply repeat conditioned responses. They generate sentences they have never heard before. They grasp structure, not just sequence. Chomsky's critique did not single-handedly destroy behaviorism, but it struck a major blow at precisely the point where behaviorism had become most overconfident. At roughly the same time, psychology was moving into cognitive revolution. The mind returned. Researchers once again began speaking openly about memory, perception, attention, reasoning, and information processing. The field was no longer satisfied with describing behavior from the outside alone. It wanted to understand the mechanisms of thought. And that created the conditions for Darwin's deeper prediction to come back into focus. If psychology is once again willing to talk about the mind, then the evolutionary question could return with new force. Not just how bodies evolved, but how the mind itself may have been shaped by natural selection. The shift was also driven by new developments with evolutionary biology. One of Darwin's hardest problems had always been altruism. How could self-sacrificing behavior evolve in a world governed by natural selection? Why would an organism help another at a cost to itself? Why would sterile worker insects even exist? Later thinkers refined the theory. W.D. Hamilton developed the idea of inclusive fitness, showing that genes can spread not only through direct reproduction, but also through helping relatives who share those genes. George C. Williams argued strongly that natural selection should be understood primarily at a level of individual rather than the group. John Maynard Smith brought the mathematical logic of games and strategy into the evolutionary situations in which the success of one individual depends on the behavior of others. Robert Trivers introduced influential ideas about reciprocal altruism and parental investment. These developments helped create a more sophisticated Darwinian understanding of behavior. They also brought greater attention to the gene pool, meaning the total collection of genes in a population. Evolution alters the pool over time. Traits and behaviors matter because they affect survival and reproduction, and therefore the long-term distribution of genes. Out of this intellectual environment came sociobiology, especially in the 1970s. Sociobiology tried to explain social behavior in animals and humans through evolutionary reasoning. It placed strong emphasis on function, adaptive significance, and the spread of genes. To some scientists, this was an exciting synthesis. To others, it looked alarming. No figure became more central to the controversy than E.O. Wilson. His 1975 book, Sociobiology: The New Synthesis, became a defining work of the movement. It also sparked intense backlash. For many critics, the problem was not simply a scientific disagreement. It was a moral and political fear. Once biology enters discussions of human social behavior, people worry that it will be used to justify inequality, hierarchy, or injustice. Those fears were powerful enough that the debates became openly hostile. At a scientific meeting in 1978, protesters charged the stage while Wilson was preparing to speak, and one of them poured water over his head. That image says a great deal about the emotional climate of the time. This was not a mild academic quarrel. It was a struggle over what kinds of explanations were permitted near the most sensitive questions about humanity. Over time, the word sociobiology lost some of its appeal, partly because it became so entangled with those bitter public battles, but the underlying ideas did not disappear. In modern form, they continued in evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology argues that the human mind contains evolved mental mechanisms shaped by natural selection in the distant past. In other words, the mind has history. It is not an empty container waiting for the culture to fill it. Neither is it a rigid machine with simple one-line instincts. It is a product of evolution, development, and environment all at once. This is where the phrase environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or EEA, becomes important. The EEA does not refer to one exact place or single moment in prehistory. It refers more broadly to the kinds of ancestral conditions under which human psychological adaptations were formed. Many theorists emphasize the Pleistocene, the long era in which humans lived as hunter-gatherers. The claim is not that they were trapped in the Stone Age mentally. It is that some of our mental tendencies may make more sense when understood as responses to recurring ancestral problems involving danger, food, cooperation, kinship, mating, parenting, and conflict. The cognitive revolution made this new Darwinian psychology easier to imagine because cognition itself could now be studied again. The brain was increasingly described as a system for processing information, and some psychologists argue that its evolved function is computational in a broad sense. That did not mean the brain is literally a modern machine. It meant that the brain could be understood as a physical system designed by evolution to handle problems and regulate behavior. Evolutionary psychology gradually gained more visibility in mainstream psychology and in textbooks. Over time, the amount of textbook attention given to it increased. It also became more accurately portrayed than it had been in earlier decades. Still, criticism remained. Some people felt it focused too narrowly on mating. Others argued that it sometimes told neat stories about the past that were difficult to test directly. Those criticisms are important and they remain part of the conversation. But the larger Darwinian point has been difficult to push away. Human beings are not outside nature. The human mind is not suspended above biology. At the same time, the Darwinian view does not require us to say that culture is an illusion, or that there are simple genes for every behavior. or that humans are being prisoners of biology. In fact, one of the more important ideas in this later discussion is behavioral plasticity. Human beings are highly flexible. They can adapt and develop in many ways that enhance fitness under changing conditions. Culture matters, learning matters, environment matters, but those things do not float free of evolution. They happen within an organism that was itself shaped by evolutionary history. That is why old nature versus nurture debate eventually begins to look too crude. The deeper story is not nature or nurture, it is nature developing through nurture. It is inherited structure interacting with experience. It is an evolved brain entering a social world, a cultural world, a developmental world, and being shaped within all of those layers at once. By the end of this long history, the intellectual movement becomes clear. Darwin opened the problem. Ethologists like Lorenz and Tinbergen showed that behavior could be studied as an evolved feature of life. Comparative psychologists and behaviorists showed the power of learning, reinforcement, and careful experimental observation, even as they often reduced the mind too far. The cognitive revolution reopened the inner architecture of thought. Sociobiology reignited the evolutionary analysis of behavior with enormous controversy. Evolutionary psychology pushed the question further by asking how a natural selection may have shaped the mind itself. And the most enduring lesson may be the simplest one. Human behavior cannot be understood from a single angle. Ask only what triggers a behavior in the moment, and you miss its development. Ask only how it develops, and you may miss its evolutionary history. Ask only what function it serves, and you may ignore the mechanisms that produce it. Ask only about environment, and you may miss the inheritance. Ask only about inheritance, you may miss culture, experience, and plasticity. This is why Tinbergen's framework still feels so powerful. It does not reduce behavior to one explanation. It reminds us that explanation has depth. Behavior lives in mechanisms, development, history, and function all at once. That insight matters because the stakes of the story are not limited to birds, dogs, pigeons, or insects. The story turns back toward us. It asks why human beings love, fear, compete, cooperate, attach, resent, parent, speak, and organize their social lives the way they do. It asks why some patterns seem to recur across cultures and across history. It asks why the minds feel both immediate and ancient at the same time. In the end, that is the emotional force of the whole intellectual journey. Darwin did not simply change biology. He helped make it possible to ask whether the human mind itself belongs to history. The answer that emerged was not simple, and it is still debated. But one thing became harder and harder to deny. The mind did not appear out of nowhere. It has a past, and any serious attempt to understand human nature has to reckon with that fact. This video was inspired by Evolution and Human Behavior, Darwinian Perspectives on Human Condition. If this story interested you and you want to go deeper into Darwin, ethology, behaviorism, sociobiology, and evolutionary psychology, it is a fascinating book and well worth the read for yourself. Thank you so much for spending the time with me and exploring these deeper questions about nature, behavior, and the human mind. I truly appreciate you being here, and I hope you will come back for the next one. Until next time, keep looking deeper.